3000 NFL mock draft.
3000 NFL mock draft.
With your friends Kenneth and Rob. Talking about the NFL draft and the Seahawks.
3000 NFL mock draft.
3000 NFL mock draft.
All right, this is 3000 NFL mock draft. I'll never get sick of that song. I love it. Thank you, Soren Raven, once again, for providing that theme music. And as it is, this is 3000 NFL mock draft, the weekly podcast where myself, Kenneth Arthur of fieldgoals.com, and Rob Staten of SeahawksDraftBlog.com get together and talk about the NFL draft and the Seahawks and the teams in the NFL and what goes into these drafts as we try and get the most information possible to try and crack the code of what will happen in April of this year, late April, when the 2016 NFL draft goes down. And today it is March 7th, I believe, 2016, the first day of the NFL's tampering period of free agency, meaning that agents can finally talk to teams and sort of start to figure out what their clients are worth and basically come to handshake agreements, which sort of the whole idea of a tampering period seems weird to me, that you could have something that literally is called break the rules moments of the NFL. If they have the rules, why do they have to have a tampering period? Why don't they just make the rules differently? It just seems weird to me to call it a tampering period. Rob, does this make any sense to you? Why does the NFL have a tampering period rather than simply letting guys sign now instead of a week from now?
I think it's just the league trying to do something about an issue that there's always been there, and it's a total waste of time because teams will go to the combine and speak to agents and will get a feel for the market anyway, and then about 10 days later they have this 2-day period where tampering goes on. I mean, if free agency had started yesterday and they'd just not had the legal tampering period, would it have made any real difference? It just seems like a total waste of time from the league, and there's no reason why they shouldn't just be able to move on and just have the free agency thing just start a couple of days earlier.
Yeah, and this week it's already been big for a former Seahawks coach, Gus Bradley, with the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jaguars improved last season a little bit to 5-11, and they after making some cuts, including former Seahawk Chris Clemens, they were at $82 million in cap room, meaning that they can pretty much do whatever they want as long as guys are willing to play for the Jaguars. A year ago, they did attract some free agents, Jared Odrick and Julius Thomas. They did get some pretty big free agents, but we did see that it was sort of difficult for these crappy teams with a lot of cap room to really make the big signings, the Damakung Sues and that kind of thing. But today, the Jaguars signed Malik Jackson to a $90 million deal, perhaps the biggest free agent right now, I guess. Certainly he's going to get, looks like maybe the biggest contract. So they get Jackson. They trade for, or no. I'm trying to think what other thing. They're just in on a lot of guys supposedly as well, including Bruce Irvin, including, I'm thinking, that they could be going after Olivier Vernon as well. It's being reported. So all of these pass rushers, as far as Gus Bradley's Jaguars are concerned, with the moves they made last year with Blake Bortles, how do you feel about that pass rush as it stands right now with Malik Jackson? How much did they sort of overpay in order to get a person of note to play for them? And will it ultimately be a good move for them? Jackson, 14.5 career sacks. Does he fit with what Gus Bradley wants to do?
Well, there's two ways of looking at what Jacksonville are doing. First of all, they have to spend a lot of money because they have so much cap room, and teams have a limit on how much they have to spend. So Oakland and Jacksonville are kind of the two teams that can be forgiven for overpaying a little bit. The Raiders are going to sign Khalid Chosamili for a ridiculous amount of money for a guard, and Jacksonville have done the same with Malik Jackson. So it's kind of understandable for both teams. The issue that I think both teams have is that it's very hard to be a bad team and then bring in some free agents that cost a lot of money and then create a good team. Sort of the way that the great teams are built by establishing an identity and a culture. And it's often that teams will use free agency just to get them over the final step. That's what the Seahawks did in 2013 when they signed Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill and traded for Percy Harvin. It's what the Broncos did after they lost that Super Bowl, in bringing a few extra pieces in to just help that defense become elite. It is not what teams have generally do. They don't build through free agency. And it seems a little bit like that is what Jacksonville is trying to do. They've had some success in the draft, but it looks to me like they're now trying to put together an elite defense in free agency. And that's just not going to work. Unfortunately for Gus Bradley, he's not created a culture of that team. He's not created the kind of identity that he wants to do. He's in a situation now where if he does not deliver a winning team this year, then he's going to get fired and they're going to blow things up and move forward in a very different direction. So they've got to win now. It's kind of understandable that they're spending the money, but if they hope to become a great team by bringing outsiders into a non-existent culture, then they're probably just going to be a pretty average team again next year.
Yeah, and I mean, they have no choice but to spend money, right? It's interesting, just like they have to get the guys, they have to spend the money. They can't just pay their own guys because they haven't drafted enough. It's interesting to look at I was thinking about the Seahawks last night, and when you look at the fact that, they're losing like Bruce Irvin and J.R. Sweezy, and that they have to re-up certain other guys. I mean, if you looked at their top 15 guys, the 15 best players on the team, not very many of them are on their rookie deals anymore. I mean, you're talking about Tyler Lockett, Thomas Rawls, Frank Clark. You can't really name a big name on the Seahawks right now that's on their rookie contract, as far as I can tell. I mean, they've locked up pretty much everybody to second contracts, and the ones that they will not. They're obviously. J.R. Sweezy is leaving, and Russell Kung could be leaving, and not that his rookie deal was all that helpful, but then Bruce Irvin, obviously his rookie contract out the door, but they've re-upped Bobby Wagner, Richard Sherman, Cam Chancellor, Earl Thomas. But the Seahawks, they were not in the position. You have to be in the position to have the players on your own team worth re-signing, and at this point, until Allen Robinson and and Blake Bortles get to that time for them to sign extensions, which will be still a couple years down the line, the Jaguars have no choice but to essentially overpay and sign some guys. They could be going after Irvin and Sweezy, from what I understand. And will they be better? I mean, in that division, pretty much anybody can win it at this point, including the Tennessee Titans, who traded for DeMarco Murray. The Colts, I hear they're up at Courtney Upshaw. But the Colts, they still don't look that great. And the Texans, could they be signing Brock Osweiler? As far as the AFC South is concerned, there's been a lot of movement because any team in there might feel like they have the opportunity to get involved with winning the division next year. Is there anybody that you think has sort of taken the lead after, a few weeks into this year? Do you think that there's a team in the AFC South that you think is doing it the most right for next season?
Well, it still, to me, looks like a really bad division. I don't think it's going to change much next year. The thing about the Jaguars is that they have drafted some fairly good players. So you mentioned Allen Robinson. Telvin Smith is one of the best young defensive playmakers in the league and is going to have a good career. I think they've made one or two decent moves on the offense. And I also think they're a bit of a red herring as well. I mean, Blake Bortles put up a lot of stats last year and the receivers did well, but I don't think anybody who actually watched Jacksonville play, more than 2 or 3 times would say that they looked like a threatening team. They're the kind of team that you really don't know what you're going to get week to week. So one week they will put up 40 points, have a decent performance on defense, and they'll win the game. And they're just as easily going to turn up and lose, 35-3 or something like that. I mean, they've struggled to create any kind of identity, and now they're trying to bring players in on big money. I mean, the one thing you can say for Jacksonville is at least they're signing players like Malik Jackson who are actually good, unlike the Colts, who just seem to go out and sign bad players for big money. I mean, they re-signed Allen, the tight end, today and gave him, like top tier tight end money. And I think he caught something like 3 passes last year. The Colts, Courtney Upshaw is a guy that I really liked at Alabama. But if that's the guy that they're going for to upgrade their defense, then it's just another example that Ryan Grigson is one of the worst GMs in the league. I mean, he's been gifted Andrew Luck. You know, what a platform to build from as a young GM, and then to have all the cap money as well on a young team that was, built around Peyton Manning to rebuild the team, and he's just wasted money. I mean, they should be winning that division comfortably every year. They didn't even win it last season. Houston won it, and they had about 6 quarterbacks last year. So I think that the one team that is probably going to feel pretty good about their situation right now is Houston, who won it last season, because they've shown that they have pretty much everything. They have a star receiver in DeAndre Hopkins. They have a toughness on defense led by J.J. Watt. They have more than just J.J. Watt on defense. They have some pretty good players. There's still a chance that Jadeveon Clowney could, have a breakout year the next season as well. The only thing that they're missing is consistency at quarterback. If they find consistency at quarterback, it doesn't have to be, Russell Wilson or someone like that, Ben Roethlisberger playing back there. If they could get a quarterback who could just throw for 25 touchdowns and 12 interceptions, they probably have to be the favorites to win that division again next year.
I mean, I ask you, because you said at least Malik Jackson is good, and I'm not like flat out, disagreeing or anything like that, but I really am curious why. Why is Malik Jackson good? 6 months ago, nobody had ever heard of this guy. Halfway into the season, you would have just said, oh, he's a nice role player. I mean, he had 1.5 sacks over the last 10 games of the season. He had 0 sacks in the playoffs. So he had 1.5 sacks over the last 13 games that he played in last season. He played next to Von Miller and DeMarcus Ware and Derek Wolfe and Salah Williams, and, on the best defense in the NFL. And he gets paid $90 million, $42 million guaranteed. Only 2 defensive ends or defensive linemen in the entire NFL had a bigger guarantee. One of those was for like $42.8 million or whatever. So basically the second biggest guarantee ever to a defensive lineman. And Malik Jackson, you could say that Derek Wolfe was better, and the Broncos, he screwed up because he signed the extension, which is about a third of what Malik Jackson got. When they were drafted the same year, Derek Wolfe was the 2nd round pick. Malik Jackson was the 5th round pick out of Tennessee. And I have a hard time believing that Malik Jackson is going to become a great player. I think, and at some point, is this an example of signing a guy like at his peak when it's like he's just won the Super Bowl and that the Broncos don't want to lose him, but at the same time, he just seemed like a role player to me.
Well, the one thing that he does really, really well, and it's tough to find play, and this is why he's so coveted this offseason, is his quickness off the snap. So he will consistently get off the ball quicker than anybody else. He will get into the backfield and force plays out wide. Now, that's not to take anything away from Von Miller or DeMarcus Ware or Shane Ray or any of the other guys they have in Denver, but it makes your life easier as an edge rusher if the quarterback has to move off the spot very quickly. Now, one of the things that a lot of people wanted to praise Willie Hayes after the Rams-Seahawks game in Week 16 because Willie Hayes had a big game statistically. But if you actually go back and watch the tape, Aaron Donald just blows up the inside, forces Russell Wilson to run, and Willie Hayes isn't even rushing. He's just containing his position. He's just holding position. He's not even pressing against the tackle. But because Wilson is being consistently moved off the spot, he runs straight into Willie Hayes, who gets, I think, 2 or 3 sacks in the game. Now, that is what interior pressure does. It's moving a guy off the spot and making life easy for your edge rushers. Now, if Jacksonville can get Malik Jackson doing that, if they can provide some stoutness alongside him, and that is essentially what Derek Wolfe was brought in to do, terrific against the run, can hold his position. And if they can get somebody who can do that, and maybe Jared Odrick can do that, then they can get Jackson just sort of rushing in there, trying to push the pocket back, trying to get the quarterback off the spot. And he may not ever be a 10 to 12 sack guy like Kawan Shaw or Aaron Donald, but his impact will still be felt. I think the one big problem is that whenever you take, you make a very good point, Kenny, that he's statistically wasn't fantastic on a great defense. Now you take him out of a great defense that had fantastic secondary and a guy like Von Miller, is he going to have the same impact? If teams can double up on Malik Jackson, is Dante Fowler coming off an ACL injury going to be able to win off the edge? Because if teams aren't fearful of Jackson, and they shut him down, then the responsibility goes back. Let's say that the Seahawks shut down Aaron Donald, as daft as that might sound. If they shut down Aaron Donald in that Week 16 game, is Willie Hayes having the same success rushing the edge? Probably not. So it's up to Jackson to sort of be able to prove that even if he's going to get double-teamed in Jacksonville's defense, that he can still produce. That is going to be the big question for him.
It is interesting too, the way that you frame it, how important Malik Jackson was last year. I mean, in another world where the Broncos don't make the playoffs, and I don't, for one, I think if the Broncos don't make the playoffs, Malik Jackson signs like sort of a secondary signing. It's not like the headliner. It's not $90 million. I think if the Broncos don't make the playoffs, which they were close to doing, a lot of these guys sort of hit that second wave of free agency. But, it is what it is. But I think that what's interesting, too, is the way that you frame it as how important Malik Jackson was to everybody else around him as well, not just how they helped him. So you look at the Denver Broncos, who, just won the Super Bowl. You can't really do any worse at quarterback. So, whether they re-sign Brock Osweiler, whether they, sign somebody else like a Ryan Fitzpatrick or, I don't know, Chase Daniel or something like that, whatever, and draft a guy and start him something. They can't really do worse at quarterback. They were probably the worst team in the NFL at quarterback with the exception of maybe a couple other teams. But then, they Ronnie Hillman, he's a free agent. Don't know what's going to happen. They'll probably go with C.J. Anderson and move on just like they did from Noshawn Moreno. They cut Luis Vasquez, their left guard, their starting guard. Owen Daniels, they cut him, and he's 30. He's going to be 34. But he was a very reliable target, had 46 catches for 517 yards, played a big role in the playoffs. And then you look at defense where they've lost Danny Trevathan to free agency, Malik Jackson to free agency, Aqib Talib and TJ Ward are going to be turning 30. And they get a return Von Miller and Chris Harris, probably their two new best players. Will DeMarcus Ware, take a pay cut? And then that's going to be a question. I guess what I'm all leading into is the Denver Broncos. Do you even think that they're the best team in their own division anymore?
I think that it's going to be very interesting to see how the Chiefs. I mean, the Chiefs won, what was it, something like 10 straight games to end the regular season or something like that. So I think that you could make a really strong case to say that the Chiefs are probably the strongest team, especially if they keep most of their guys, which they seem to be doing. And you could also make an argument that San Diego can always bounce back and that Oakland are making the kind of moves which maybe could see them take the next level. And with Denver coming off winning the Super Bowl, I don't think will be the same threat as actually trying to get there. That extra motivation to get there. They look to me like a team that's not going to be, consistently good for 3 or 4 years. Maybe they've had their spell. I think that they'll look at the Malik Jackson moving on as, as much as I've just sung the praises of Malik Jackson, there's nothing especially spectacular about him physically. So, it's not hard to find a guy who runs a 4.91 at 280 pounds and jumps a 28-inch vertical. They could go and draft, just to throw a name out there, Adolphus Washington from Ohio State, who had a pretty bad combine, which you'll see his stock fall maybe to around 3 or 4. If they could sign him, he's got the same kind of length, 34-inch arms, same quickness off the snap. He is somebody who could come in and do just as good a job as Malik Jackson, playing next to DeMarcus Ware, Von Miller, Shane Ray, Sly Williams, Derek Wolfe, and you won't notice the difference. That doesn't mean that Malik Jackson's a bad player. It's just that you can find that type of a skill set and replace it. So I guess that is what Denver will be thinking. They have to sort out what they're going to do at quarterback. I don't think that the fact that Denver won the Super Bowl last year, Kenny, kind of just re-emphasizes to me that it was a season that was ripe for the taking. That if the Seahawks had maybe avoided some of their issues early in the season, that they could have had the kind of momentum that Carolina built up, that maybe if they had an easier schedule like Carolina had, that they could have dominated the NFC. If they'd have been at home field in the playoffs, that they would have got to the Super Bowl and probably would have beaten that Denver team with Peyton Manning basically in the second half unable to do a damn thing. So it's disappointing that they never had the opportunity to try and do that. But I think it's also representative of where the AFC is, that Denver were the best team last year. And there's not a great deal to fear there. It's just whether or not the Seahawks in 2016 can get back ahead of, Arizona and Carolina and get back to that number 1 seed.
Well, I can hear Malik Jackson counting $100 bills in the background there at Rob's home, just flipping through them, all the dollar bills. But, Mario Williams was also out there. Mario Williams signed a $100 million deal once upon a time, and he sort of lived up to it up until this last season where it just didn't seem to fit with Rex Ryan. But even that being said, Mario Williams is still Mario Williams, and people in Seattle probably wanted to know, whether or not he could be a fit for the Seahawks and whether or not he'd be affordable. And I think, the idea of Mario Williams was not affordable, but he signs with the Miami Dolphins, putting him next to Damakung Su and potentially next to Cameron Wake, who they, want to renegotiate with, but maybe, and they say they plan to keep along. So the Miami Dolphins, after adding former Seahawk Byron Maxwell and Kiko Alonso as well, they're obviously trying to move. They've renegotiated the deal of Jordan Cameron to save some money there. It could be an interesting defense for the Miami Dolphins. How good if you had been able to sign Mario Williams to a 2-year, I think $16 million deal to the Seahawks, would you have done that?
I was a bit surprised at how many Seahawks fans, and I'm following it on Twitter and social media, and to see Seahawks fans kind of pining for moves like this. Would I want to sign Mario Williams for $8 million? No. I mean, I don't put a lot into Pro Football Focus's gradings, but when they have the guy ranked 101st out of 101 edge rushers last year, that to me seems a very extreme grade.
And they do say, apparently, I mean, because the grades are the grades, but, you like their counting stats. They say that Mario Williams had one pressure for every 13.7 pass rushes, which was the 5th worst for a 4-3 defensive end. Olivier Vernon, who was the transition tag, 1 for every 6.1. So basically had a pressure more than twice as often as Mario Williams. So definitely not the same guy that we had come to expect.
And I know the scheme didn't work for Mario Williams, and that he will probably do a lot better in Miami than he did in Buffalo. But that said, I mean, for me, it's not the kind of move the Seahawks ever make, and I'm surprised that people are pining for him and for Donald Penn and for just let's just call these guys what they are. Players well into their 30s who have seen better days, who are going to earn more money than they should, and it's not about. I mean, if they were to pay Mario Williams $8 million, let's just consider that for a second. That would be more money than Michael Bennett, and that would be considerably more money than Cliff Averill. Would you really want Williams to earn more than those two guys after what they've done for you for the last couple of years? That would not be sending the right message to someone like Michael Bennett, who is probably worthy of a pay rise or a contract extension for the way that he's performed for this team and become a leader, to go and sign Mario Williams and give him $8 million. That is not how the Seahawks have been built. And it's not the kind of move that they make. And nobody should really be hoping that they sign these types of, big name free agents who are going to go and, play badly for another team. What the Seahawks need to do is try, as they've stated themselves, is try and keep as many of their existing players together and then reload in the second or third wave in free agency, which they've been experts at doing. It's in that sort of wave when they found Averill and Bennett, when they've found Ataba Rubin, when they've found guys who can really help them, Tony McDaniel, people like that have done a great job for them. It's when they've actually spent money on someone like Kerry Williams that they've struggled. They gave Kerry Williams something like $6-7 million last year. That's not the type of move that has worked for them. And then you've got the draft as well. So I think the best thing for the Seahawks to do is Seahawks fans is to forget about the Mario Williamses, forget about Donald Penn, forget about all of these big names that are being linked with all the other teams. Can they, and this is the key for the Seahawks, can they keep Jeremy Lane, which would be a huge plus if they can? Do they want to keep Brandon Meebane, and what is it going to take to keep him? If they don't keep Meebane, who else are they going to bring in at defensive tackle to replace him? And what happens with Russell Okung? I suspect that, having initially thought that he was going to get a great market and go somewhere else, the fact that it has been so quiet on Okung, not even a hint of teams being involved. I just wonder if his current shoulder injury and the fact that he's representing himself is going to end up with him getting a quiet market. And if that happens, it's going to be how much do the Seahawks want to have him back, even if it's on just a 1-year deal? How much?
I think that one of the things is Russell Okung, because he doesn't have an agent, even though he's representing himself, he actually can't talk to teams. So he can't talk to teams until next week.
Sure, but I would expect, well, he can talk to teams tomorrow. You would sort of, all of the big names are being linked. We hear that Bruce, the Cardinals are interested in Bruce Irvin, and, this team's interested in this guy. I would have thought there would have been, and maybe this will be completely wrong, but there's not even been hey, the Lions would like to speak to Russell Okung tomorrow, or, This team is interested in Russell Okung. He can't speak with them until tomorrow, though. There's not even been that type. And the guy has got a very serious shoulder injury. He's had a backlog of injuries in his career. And I just wonder if the whole representing himself thing is not going to work for him. When he goes and speaks to teams and they're giving him the hard sell and giving him a few home truths, maybe, how is he going to react to that? And I don't know. I just keep seeing these things. Like the Seahawks in the last half an hour have been tweeting pictures of him at some event. I think he's been back at his old high school, giving them a golden football for the fact that he played for this in Super Bowl 48 and Super Bowl 49. And the fact that the Seahawks are tweeting pictures about Russell Okung today, I don't know. It just seems like maybe there is something to be done there on a team-friendly deal for a season. I don't know. I just get the feeling that there might be something to go there, but at the same time, I could just as easily see him leave. I think he's probably the big question mark, but he's going to be the key for the whole draft as well, because if they lose Russell Okung, they almost certainly have to take a tackle at the number 26 pick. If he moves on, then it broadens their horizons to be able to either take a defensive lineman or take a guy who, I've talked about Jermaine Ifedi a lot. He could play left guard easily for the Seahawks next year and then move to tackle in the future. They could do that, or they could draft a defensive lineman. Okung is going to be the key to what they do for pretty much the whole offseason now.
And what did you think of, because someone just told me that I've been pronouncing his name wrong my entire life, basically, since he became a part of my life in 2010. Okung. I think I've been saying Okung, but Okung. You say it right, I say it wrong. Russell Okung. What did I? Okung. Russell O. Is his market will be determined a lot by the other tackles and offensive linemen, and obviously the Seahawks. And how are they going to approach the offensive line market? Kelechi Osemele, who would have been come on, how could I possibly say Okung right or wrong? And I'm guessing Kelechi Osemele. It sounds perfectly right. 5-year, $60 million deal. With the Raiders. Osemele, as far as I know, doesn't have these injury problems, is younger, and probably have been more consistent, though not a left tackle for the most part of his career. There's a question, will he be the left tackle for the Raiders? He's got left tackle money, even not just left tackle money, but great left tackle money, 5-year, $60 million deal. Do you like the deal of Osemele? And, we can sort of disregard the fact that the Raiders have to pay more money just in order to get to the cap minimum.
Well, from that point of view, I think it's okay. But from just looking at the player and judging him and how much he's going to get paid, I think it's a bad deal. People have gravitated. This is what NFL fans and media tend to do. They've kind of gravitated to the big name offensive lineman and decided that he's really good, because people love to praise offensive linemen more than any other position. Now, Osemele has been pretty good for most of his time in Baltimore playing guard. He actually played left tackle because they decided that Eugene Monroe was soft as crap, just like Jacksonville decided when they traded him to Baltimore in the first place. So they moved Eugene Monroe out of the lineup and then put Osemele at left tackle to try him there. And that was the end of that. But, he's not a left tackle. I mean, if you want to play him at left tackle at Oakland, you're taking a bit of a wild stab in the dark here, that you're hoping that he's going to be a left tackle for you. He will be better inside at guard, but this is, you can praise the best guards in the NFL as much as you want, and I know that this will be a sore point for Seahawks fans because of the whole Hutchinson thing when he left, but guards do not win you football games. It's as simple as that. They might be able, the bad one might lose you a single game, but a guard is not going to win you a championship. Look at the teams over the years who've won the Super Bowl and tell me the elite offensive guards who've been playing for those teams. Most of the teams, like Green Bay when they won it, I think in 2010, and Pittsburgh when they won it, and other teams like that, have actually won championships with bad offensive lines, let alone having fantastic guards. It just doesn't happen. So while it seems like a great move and it's a nice high profile move for the Raiders, it's hard to get excited about it. And funnily enough, I've spent a lot of time talking about Texas A&M's Jermaine Ifedi, who I think it'd be a good pick for the Seahawks in the first round. If you want to compare him physically to anybody, he matches up almost identically to Kalichi Osemele. So if you want a player with the upside and the physical potential of Osemele, and you want to pay him $1.5 million as a salary instead of $12.5 million, then just draft Jermaine Ifedi, because you're going to get pretty much the same player. And if you play him at left guard, I think that Ifedi will be fantastic even as a rookie. So I don't agree with spending that much money on Osemele.
It's probably also important that we talk about this, given that it is a mock draft podcast. And a draft podcast, we talk about mock drafts, we do drafts, we talk about other teams in the NFL and where they stand. Mentioned it briefly before, but the Eagles trade Byron Maxwell, Kiko Alonso, and the 13th overall pick to the Miami Dolphins in exchange for the 8th overall pick and a 4th rounder. So on one hand, we can talk about Byron Maxwell's fit with the Miami Dolphins after they cut Brent Grimes. Maxwell signs the $63 million deal last year to leave the Seahawks and we're talking about guys getting overpaid today. All due respect to Byron Maxwell. And you know what the funny thing is, that Maxwell pretty much went out and did the exact same. He had the exact same season he had last year. So he lived up to whatever it was that they should have been expecting. But clearly just not Chip Kelly's team anymore. So they're getting rid of a lot of the guys that Chip Kelly, acquired. So, what do you think about Byron Maxwell playing for the Miami Dolphins? Is he going to – it's surprising that I don't know where Miami is getting all this money. They've just spend, and I don't know how it's going to work out in the long run. But they acquire Byron Maxwell. How do you think Maxwell fits? And the Eagles move up 5 spots. How does that change your opinion of what Philadelphia is looking for in the draft?
Well, I think it's important to sort of point out at first that I think the report, which was tweeted by a guy and then he deleted it, and I think that Jeff Lane from the Philadelphia, I think the newspaper is called the Philadelphia Inquirer, I'm not sure, he's said it's an erroneous report. So we don't know that they've actually moved up from 13 to 8. That's not been confirmed by anybody. I would actually be surprised if that was part of the deal, because it's pretty clear that Philadelphia are on a fire sale right now, moving down 5 spots in the draft from Miami's point of view to acquire 2 guys that the Philadelphia Eagles are desperate to get rid of would not, it'd be ridiculous. So I can't see it being quite as sweet a deal as that. On Maxwell, I thought the one thing with Byron Maxwell was that I thought he consistently took chances in Seattle, and that he would risk getting beat to try and make a play. And in 2013, at the back end of that year, it just seemed like everything worked for him. So like nearly everything he did came off. I remember there was one game again, the game that they lost in San Francisco late in the year, the second game they lost that season. He had a pick on Kaepernick when he got beat downfield again, sort of trying to guess what the play was going to be, bit on it a little bit, got beat. And then just sort of ran back and sort of manhandled this guy and then got the interception, and it would have been pass interference in pretty much every other game. Got away with it, made the interception. Everybody's very happy about that. The following year in 2014, again, took a lot of chances. He just so happened to have the best game of his season in Philadelphia against the Eagles. And I think that kind of stuck in the mind with Chip Kelly. And it's ultimately why he got paid as much as he did. Now, if you're willing to live with the fact that he is going to make mistakes, he's going to get beat, he's going to take chances, then you'll be quite satisfied with his play. But as soon as you start paying him $10 million a year, you're expecting, Darrelle Revis, you're expecting Richard Sherman, you're expecting him to take away a team's number one, you're expecting him to shut down guys. You're not expecting to see him get beat. You don't expect him to, break up every single pass, but you just sort of want solidity and consistency from a guy who's getting paid that much. And that is not what Byron Maxwell is. He's a playmaker, but he's not a solid, functional number one lockdown corner. So if Miami are prepared to play him in a certain way and allow for him to play his natural game, then good for them. But if they're expecting him to shut down one side of the field, it's just not going to happen.
Well, my bad on spreading an erroneous report, or potentially erroneous report there. Though, yeah, I guess I'm just excited for the first trades of the first round. As people move around, it'll happen eventually. Other moves out there, Richie Incognito. It's interesting just to see how much Richie Incognito has managed to salvage his career after the disaster with the Dolphins. He gets a second chance with the Bills. everybody's like he's a good player, but I never. Now he signs a 3-year, $15 million deal. Would you want Incognito any part of the Seahawks?
No. I mean, I was never interested in signing that guy. I mean, he's perfect for Rex Ryan and so the attitude of the Rex Ryan team in Buffalo. They were the only team willing to give him a chance, and ultimately he's re-signed there, and he can say, "Oh, I wanted to reward the team for giving me a chance. I want to come back here." Well, that's great for him, but I can't imagine. I could never imagine the Seahawks signing that guy. I mean, someone posted on my blog that they needed someone like him, and I just thought, well, why? They've got by this far without someone like Richie Incognito. They don't need that kind of an influence in the locker room. This is an opportunity right now for the Seahawks to allow for a complete change in their leadership. It's going on now. It kind of happened towards the end of last year. Russell Wilson is going to be the identity and the leader on that offense, along with guys like Doug Baldwin and people like that. They are going to lead the offense now. It used to be Marshawn Lynch. The last thing they really needed was someone like Richie Incognito throwing his weight around in that locker room and being himself. And even if he was not being racist or whatever he was accused of in Miami, and whatever, being offensive or a bully or the kind of things he was saying in Miami, even if he's not doing those things, he's still Richie Incognito. He's still going to have that aspect of his personality. I mean, he's not going to be walking into the locker room, wearing a neatly buttoned shirt and a lovely pair of slacks and, saying please and thank you all the time. I just don't think it was at any point likely that the Seahawks were going to go down that road. In terms of offensive linemen they could sign in this offseason, Kenny, I thought that Phil Loadholt was the best opportunity for them if he was released by Minnesota. And it was a real shame to see that Phil Loadholt actually restricted his contract to stay in Minnesota for another year. So that was a bit of a blow because he could have played left guard or right tackle and fit Seattle perfectly. Looking at the rest of the offensive linemen who are left, there's not a great deal there that appeals. A lot of these guys are going to cost a lot of money. I still think the best option for them at left tackle is to keep Russell Okung on a team-friendly deal if they can. I don't like any of the guard options except for maybe Alex Boone, but I think he's probably too tall for Tom Cable's scheme. They haven't gone as high as 6'8", and I think they have a real issue with height. I think that's a big thing for them and their ideals. So I'm not quite sure that he would fit them either or be cheap enough for them. But I genuinely think that it's Okung or nobody, and then just sort of look at the draft or look in the second or third wave, see what's left.
I'm going to just run really quickly through some more of the free agents before we, move on past sort of the free agent news today. But I just want to run quickly through some of the free agents, and since they will probably sign with someone or be rumored to be signing with someone here in the next few days before our next episode of the podcast, Rob, a lot of these guys are guys you scouted for the draft because they are, coming off of their fourth season, guys in the 2011, 2012 NFL drafts. So I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are. Are they overrated or going to be a really good get for whoever signs them? And we mentioned him briefly before, but it doesn't sound like that Olivier Vernon will necessarily be going back to the Dolphins, especially now. I mean, obviously, they could, I hear, even rescind the transition tag. So, overrated or really great player, Olivier Vernon?
I actually watched a lot of Olivier Vernon because sort of going back and having a look at some of his sort of key moments, because I wanted to see if he was an option for a guy who ultimately could be like the next Cliff Averill or Michael Bennett. And that was before, he exploded into becoming this, big name who was going to receive a lot of attention. I think that he's a pretty good player, underrated, not a big guy. He's only 6'2", but he's quite strong, quite powerful. And I think if you want him to be sort of like a top tier number one pass rusher, then he's not going to be the guy. But if you're willing to put him as part of a 3-man rotation and ask him to be an 8 to 10 sack guy, then I think he could be really good. And I think that he's in today's NFL, he's well worth, $10 million of anybody's money on an average.
It's hard to justify signing running backs in free agency when they are so effective in their first couple of years, even as second and third round picks, and as we've seen with Thomas Rawls, undrafted free agency. But Doug Martin, just like DeMarco Murray a year earlier, was perhaps, I don't think that DeMarco Murray was the best running back in the NFL in 2014 when he led the league in, yards and touchdowns, but very good. Now, obviously, Murray going to the Tennessee Titans, but Doug Martin is available. Overrated? Do you think that Doug Martin is a player that could help a team make the playoffs next year?
I loved Doug Martin in the draft. So he was at Boise State, and I really hope that the Seahawks would find a way to draft him. And the thing is that he kind of, really his stock just flew up right before the end of the draft. So at one point it looked like he might last to Seattle's second round pick. And going into that 2012 draft, I knew that the Seahawks were interested in signing a running back to take some of the pressure off Marshawn Lynch, and that they were willing to take a running back higher than most people expected. Obviously, Doug, I think Tampa Bay traded, I think they swapped fifth round picks or something. It didn't cost them anything to actually move up into the late first round. They swapped with Denver and took Doug Martin with, I think, the 31st pick or 30th pick in the first round. And it was a bit of a shame, but I mean, obviously Seattle got Bobby Wagner in the end, and the rest is history, so it was fine. But I
think he went right next to David Wilson, I believe.
Yeah, it's true. And I loved Martin, and then he had a great rookie year and then just fell off a cliff and then bounced back last year. I actually think he's a really good player for somebody, because he's not going to have a lot of tread on the tires. And while it's a bit suspicious that he was non-existent after a great rookie year and then bounced back in a contract year, maybe he's going to go back to being very average again if he gets paid. I actually think he's a really good player. And if you're a team that doesn't have a running back and wants to establish a running game, and I think he's been linked with Oakland, and, that would be a nice get for them, to plug him in, complement what they already have at running back there, work in a bit of a rotation at running back. And I think that'd be a nice little pick up for them. So I'm going to say that he's pretty good, yeah.
Someone that we saw a lot in the NFC West with the St. Louis, now LA Rams, upset that he didn't get the franchise tag like his teammate Tremaine Johnson. Janoris Jenkins is a guy that went in I believe the second round. He fell because of concerns about his character, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about that. But Janoris Jenkins now, as the top cornerback on the market, many people say is being seen sort of as a cornerstone of a defense. Do you think Jenkins has come that far in his career?
Another player who I really liked in the draft, and watching his college tape, he screamed top 15 talent. And it was the character issues were the only reason he fell into round two. And I think in the NFL, if anything, he's been a little bit he's been good, but he hasn't been great. And watching him at college, I thought he could be great. And it's perhaps not a surprise, given his skill set and the fact that he stayed out of trouble. In fairness to him, with all the character concerns, you've not heard a peep really, have you, about any issues off the field from him? No. I think that's probably to his credit and shows that maybe he's turned over a new leaf. I'd be a bit hesitant paying him $14 million a year, because he's not Richard Sherman or Revis or Josh Norman. He just isn't. He's a pretty good corner, playing on a very good defense, who has Aaron Donald and Robert Quinn and had Chris Long. So I'd be hesitant paying him $14 million a year. But if I was the Rams, I would want to keep him around. I'd want to sort of reward him for what he's done so far. I don't think he's an elite cornerback, but I think he's a very good one.
The Kansas City Chiefs, we're talking about the AFC West. Will the Broncos, fall down? How much better can the Raiders get with Amari Cooper and Derek Carr and Khalil Mack, and now Osemele, and, are they going to get good enough? Because the Chiefs, have some really big free agents. Looks like they're re-signing Tamba Ali to a 3-year contract, but Sean Smith, Derek Johnson, after, 10 years as a free agent, and former Seahawk Jay Howard, who, if he had stayed with Seattle, perhaps, their 2012 class, it would be amazing to have seen if Jay Howard could have played as well for the Seahawks as he has for the Chiefs over the last 2 years, but it didn't work out that way. Those three guys, but especially the two guys, Sean Smith and Jay Howard, how good of a corner and how good can Jay Howard be in a different system?
Well, you're picking a lot of players that I really liked going into the draft, and Sean Smith was another one who was he was a safety, but he had speed, and he was one of those guys who could play safety or cornerback, and I liked him as a potential pick. And although he's a little older nowadays, he had a very good career in Miami. I think Kansas City spent a lot of money to get him, and he's tall and he's long. I think if it wasn't for the fact that Kerry Williams blew it for any outside free agent cornerbacks, he may be someone that the Seahawks might even look at. But he's a decent player. As for the defensive tackle, Jay Howard, he's a funny one because I remember looking at him before the draft and saying he could be a good pickup, in the third or fourth round. We wrote about him a lot on the blog, looking at defensive tackles who could go in that range. And then the Seahawks drafted him, and it was like, okay, that's a decent pick. And then he didn't really do anything. And then I remember going the following year to look at Sharif Floyd, who was at Florida and played alongside Jay Howard and stayed an extra year after Howard had left. And I can remember constantly watching Sharif Floyd from that season next to Jay Howard and thinking he just looks so much better than Jay Howard. I mean, you could see the difference between a guy with first-round athleticism and a guy with fourth-round athleticism, and there was a huge difference between the two. Now, funnily enough, Howard's ended up going to Kansas City and having a bit of a career for himself, but he has limitations, and I think he's probably best anchoring a defensive line in a three-man front like he has been doing, allowing other guys like Kansas City have, they've got great pass rushers, they've got a decent secondary, they've got linebackers who can make plays. If he's surrounded by guys who will make plays around him, then Jay Howard is good. But it's how much do you want to spend for a player like that? Are you going to spend top money for someone who isn't going to make you plays on his own, but might help other people make the plays? There are a lot of people like that in the league. So I wouldn't want to overspend on Jay Howard personally.
And did you have any further thoughts on, on Alex Mack now that he's a free agent? I know that you've talked a lot about him and the Seahawks need, but you don't believe that they will be making a big move like Alex Mack or Alex Boone for the offensive line, do you?
Well, Alex Mack is a terrific player. He's 30 years old now, so he wants to sort of max out this potential. It's probably his last big contract, isn't it? I mean, he's never really had a chance to test free agency. This is his one opportunity to do it. A few months ago, I would have thought the Seahawks would have been all over this. They would have been very, very interested. And there's still a chance. If there's any way at all that they can backload a contract over 3 or 4 years maybe, then this would be the guy to do it on. Just sort that center position out once and for all, and not have to worry about it. And then it takes the pressure off you if you want to sort of keep working with someone like Christian Sokoli. You've drafted a guy there as a developmental project. Well, you can have maybe 3 years to work with him as opposed to just 1 or 2 years. He's never going to be sort of a 1 or 2 year transition gets in the lineup kind of guy. He's going to need a lot of time. So Alex Mack in that regard would be ideal for the Seahawks. However, he's just ripped up an $8 million contract from Cleveland. And I've just got a feeling that I know that he's been linked with Atlanta, but I've just got this really strong feeling that the Los Angeles Rams are going to be ideal for it because Alex Mack went to California at college. They have a big need for a center. They've got a ton of cap room. It just seems to make a lot of sense. But if you were to say to me, is there anybody out of all of the big name free agents that would want the Seahawks to go after, it would probably be him, just because last year's center was a mess and Patrick Lewis did a good job holding the fort, but Alex Mack could come in, bang, you've got one of the best 5 centers in the league straight away. Don't have to worry about that position for the next couple of years. I think it'd be a really good one, but I honestly think he may well get $10 million somewhere. So I think that he's probably going to get prized out.
And I just want to I'll run through a list of guys that maybe would be on the cheaper side for the Seahawks. Maybe not cheap, but cheaper than that first or second wave of free agents. Because as we've said, and as if you said, there's not it's not just not their MO, and it's not really worked out for them to be out there and getting these guys right away. Maybe if Donald Penn is available in a month or something like that, then he's going to come at a price. And you don't have Russell Okung, but there's other guys too, like Mitchell Schwartz and Kelvin Beachum that you may even prefer. But they've re-signed Atiba Rubin, or they will re-sign Atiba Rubin to a 3-year deal, and that sort of solidifies the fact that they think they have the best 5 tech, and they don't need to replace Atiba Rubin now. There's not going to be a switch out of a Clint McDonald or Tony McDaniel. Atiba Rubin's going to be the guy. That being said, Brandon Mebane is still set to hit free agency perhaps, and may not be back, though I think that is another priority for them to just keep consistency with Mebane if they believe. But then again, maybe they think that he's at that tipping point that Chris Clemens and Red Bryant were at when they got let go by the Seahawks as well. That being said, just gonna quickly say some names, and if a couple of them at the end of it stand out to you, then just go through that. Ian Williams is a defensive tackle. Should they lose Brandon Mebane, I think would be an interesting name for them to take a look at. Aldon Smith, is he, the fact that he's going to miss the first 10 or 11 games or whatever is next year, would they be interested in bringing in a guy like Aldon Smith as another pass rusher that could be had for maybe a couple $1 million or something like that? I don't know where his contract will stand, but I would assume that he wants a 1-year deal that allows him to play and get back on, a track that gets him the huge contract that Aldon Smith could get if he was just clean for 2 years. If Aldon Smith was just, because he's still pretty young, I'm fairly certain. So there's that for Aldon Smith. Maybe BJ Raji, hasn't had, the best, last couple of years, but at the same time was once a really good player, and maybe he could fill that role by Brandon Mebane. Just going through it, Ramon Foster, a guard. Keep on moving here real quick. Alfred Morris, maybe if there was a part of them that wanted to get, a cheap Alfred Morris to help, solidify some that backfield needs, that they will go for. But I think, we've talked about the draft and being able to get running backs in the draft. Would they look for an Alfred Morris, or would he be more of a, an August type signing if you're looking for a veteran running back in the same way that they did with Fred Jackson? Let me just take another quick look here. Junior Gillette, I don't know about that. You talked about William Hayes. I think for the most part, I'm looking at Akeem Hicks. I mean, there's a lot of interest in Akeem Hicks right now. They don't need that. Stefan Wisniewski, if they were going for a cheaper center than Alex Mack, and Bilal Powell maybe as a cheaper option. Brian Quick as a wide receiver, and maybe what do you think about the wide receiver market right now? Any of those names standing out to you?
I mean, there's 1 or 2 names there. Some of the bigger names. I mean, Ian Williams, I think, is probably going to get about 7 or 8 million to be a nose tackle somewhere. He's a really good player, but I just think he's going to get too much money. I think Aldon Smith would be a really interesting pickup. I can't quite see it just because of the suspension till I think November, and he might not play at all next season. So, it's going to be tough on that one. If they could get him in, I mean, I really like Aldon Smith as a player. I mean, just what an incredible talent. Everything that you would want in an edge rusher. Just got the horrible personal issues there and flags galore because of that. But I'm very attracted to that idea if it's cheap enough. I think on the wide receiver market, one guy who's been linked is Rashard Matthews, and I think that he would be if they could get him at a certain price, then he could be a really good replacement for Jermaine Kearse, very reliable, efficient receiver, and that is what they've had with Kearse. So, I could see that Rashard Matthews at Miami being an option there. One of the guys I remember Pete Carroll talking a lot about when they played Miami in 2012 was Randy Starks, and, praising him as a one technique and everything that he does and his all-round game. He's getting up in age a little bit. I think he might be 32 or 33 this year, but if they needed to replace Brandon Mebane on the cheap, maybe Randy Starks is someone that they could look at. I think that Mebane, it's going to be interesting to see what they do on Mebane, because they paid him $5.7 million last season, which is way too much, way more than they're going to be willing to pay for that position. I think their maximum is probably $3.5–4 million, which is what Rubin's getting there. So I imagine that they've put an offer to Brandon Mebane. They've said, go and see if you can get any more. And if he can get more, then I think they'll just move on and they'll just fit somebody else in there. And I think that Starks could be a guy that they look at. I'm just looking through the list to see if there's anybody else who stands out. It's hard. There's not a great deal of guys that you would want to go with. I mean, they could maybe see what Terrence Knighton's market is. Sammy Lee Hill could be a guy that they look at. The guy whose name I can't remember, who was at Pittsburgh, who's a nose tackle, but has been pretty flexible for them. There's maybe someone they could look at as well. But aside from that, there's not a great deal. I do think that sort of wide risk. It depends who they lose more than anything. It really is going to be, can they get if they have to replace Meebane, can they replace him? Can they add to the defensive depth that they've got there? If they lose Jermaine Kearse, can they bring in another veteran receiver? I think that the running back market is going to be very interesting because I think they almost have to bring in a veteran running back because they don't want to just rely on a rookie and Thomas Rawls, I'm sure. The running game is too important for the Seahawks. It's just which veteran running back can they get, who is going to fit the price. I think Chris Ivory is looking for too much money. I like the idea of Alfred Morris, though, Kenny, because he might be cheap and they might be able to bring him in on a 1-year deal or something like that and partner him with Thomas Rawls. We've seen Alfred Morris produce in the NFL. He could be a really good option for them. I'm looking across at the other options. There isn't that much else. I can't really imagine Arian Foster or Matt Forte being in Seattle. Ronnie Hillman, no interest there. But Al Powell, I think, is going to end up back with the Jets. So Alfred Morris might be their best bet to get a veteran running back. And I think that's something they probably want to do.
One final thing to talk about, I guess, topic of free agency would be the quarterbacks. It's not something that the Seahawks need, but it is always interesting. And these moves about the quarterbacks, sometimes it seems not that important because teams don't find franchise quarterbacks on the free agent market pretty much ever. It just doesn't really happen in the sense of a Drew Brees. So much had to go right or wrong, depending on which side you're looking at it, for the Saints to end up with Drew Brees or for Drew Brees to be available at all. They had to first, he had to have a tough shoulder injury that put his whole career in jeopardy. They had to have Phillip Rivers sitting behind him, feeling comfortable that Phillip Rivers would be the guy to take over. And even then, there was talk of the Chargers franchising Drew Brees and keeping him for that next season in 2006. Brees almost went to the Dolphins, and would have played for Nick Saban if not for the shoulder injury. So all of these things had to go right. So you're not really going to find a lot of great quarterbacks in free agency. You have to draft them. Maybe you get lucky and you find yourself in a trade like a Steve Young situation where a team just doesn't have a place for Steve Young and you do. And that sort of thing works out maybe sometimes once a decade. But for the most part, these guys are getting drafted by their original teams. That being said, the Bills, they did find Tyrod Taylor last year in the small market. The interesting thing is that a lot of people don't remember maybe, but the Denver Broncos, who had Manning and Osweiler last year, offered Tyrod Taylor more money than the Buffalo Bills. So they were already planning on bringing in Tyrod Taylor to compete with Brock Osweiler for that job. And now Brock Osweiler hits free agency, and he's being seen as the starter suddenly. I don't really know why, but Brock Osweiler is one of the free agents out there. So in not a lot of these guys that are available, I don't think you can have high expectations. But at the same time, there are guys out there that are free agents, are about to be free agents that will most likely be starting in week 1 next season. And it is guys that had a modicum of success. Like I said, Osweiler did go 5-2 as the starter for Denver last season, though I think that is, misleading. Ryan Fitzpatrick almost went to the playoffs, essentially played in his first playoff game, kind of, in that Week 17 loss to the Bills against Tyrod Taylor. And then you've got Robert Griffin III, who was in that 2012 draft and arguably the best quarterback that rookie year and has fallen on hard times and is sort of an afterthought in the free agent market. I haven't heard anything on Robert Griffin III and who's going to sign him. And then Chase Daniel, who's 29, and a lot of people still think that Chase Daniel has enough to start in the league, and perhaps someone will give him a chance. So of the available quarterbacks, Rob, just speaking mostly on Osweiler, Griffin, Daniel, and Fitzpatrick, how would you sort of rank those guys in terms of which one would be the best signing for the Houston Texans or the Jets or the Browns, one of these teams that may or may not be looking for a quarterback?
I think it's incredibly fascinating to see the way that teams are now viewing the college quarterback. So that someone like Brock Osweiler, just because he's had experience in the NFL for a few years and has started a few games and has won a few games, is now seen as someone who is incredibly valuable to the tune of around $15 million a year, simply because of experience more than anything else. I mean, let's not forget, this is a guy that Denver essentially benched for Peyton Manning, and Peyton Manning, in that, he wasn't even a game manager at times. I mean, he was just a guy who handed the ball off or just somehow managed to get it out of his arm and throw it 10 yards downfield. I mean, in the second half of the Super Bowl, Manning didn't do anything. And Osweiler is going to go from playing behind that to suddenly being a starter either in Denver next year or in Houston. I think it's incredible. And it shows kind of how desperate some of the teams are, because if Denver loses Osweiler, what are they going to do at quarterback? They could go from they could capitulate pretty quickly. If you were going to ask me what I would do if I was Houston or Denver or any of these teams looking for a quarterback, I would give Chase Daniel a 1-year prove-it contract, because Chase Daniel's not going to command as much money as Brock Osweiler. If I had to turn to Chase Daniel and give him $7.5 or $8 million to play for 1 year, I'd do it, because it might be a lot of money for Chase Daniel, but you know what? At least you're taking it. You're not committing to Brock Osweiler on $15 million a year for 3 years. Robert Griffin III, I think, is pretty much finished. Ryan Fitzpatrick plays well when he has a great defense, keeping the score down. Chase Daniel, we don't know a great deal about. He's 29. He's sat in the Andy Reid offense for a while and learned his trade. I think that he has the skill set, the physical skill set, to maybe be a guy who could fill in for a year or two and help you transition to a younger quarterback. So if you were going to ask me who I would prioritize if I was one of those teams, it'd probably be someone like Chase Daniel. And even then, I'd be looking around the league, and I would not be signing Brock Osweiler on $15 million a year. I'd be looking around the league and seeing what I can get, looking at some of the experienced backups that have maybe are waiting for that opportunity, like Chase Daniel probably was. Who could I get for a 4th or 5th round pick who can maybe be a starter for a little while? That is the type of thing I'd be looking for right now, rather than, spending millions and millions. Someone like Ryan Nassib, maybe, who's, I think, still the backup in New York. Can you convince the Giants to let him go maybe a year before his contract expires, to see if he's maybe someone that you could let compete with another guy for a year? That's kind of the route I would be going down, but I would certainly prioritize Chase Daniel before spending major money on Brock Osweiler or Ryan Fitzpatrick.
Yeah, it's interesting that Chase Daniel, he had a $4.8 million cap hit last year as the backup for the Chiefs. It's like, if you sign him, it would just be interesting to see what that 1 year, is it a 1 year $8 million deal? Is it $10 million? It's weird to think about, but at the same time, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because it's almost or a catch-22 in the sense that, look at the Houston Texans last year, who essentially did the Chase Daniel thing with Brian Hoyer. They bring him in. They say, we're not going to have a great quarterback, but maybe we'll have a quarterback that gets us to the playoffs. And the Texans, they do make the playoffs, mostly with Brian Hoyer, but they had no chance of winning the Super Bowl. The Texans did not have Denver's defense or, some of these, still, they just didn't have enough on offense or defense to do what Denver did and make a great, unbelievable playoff run. So what did they do? They put themselves out. They did enough to make the playoffs for, a fruitless playoff run that wasn't going to go anywhere. And then at the same time, they put themselves out of position to draft any of the 3 first-round quarterbacks that we've been talking about on this podcast. So they're drafting in the 20s. So unless they trade up, they're not going to get Paxton Lynch or Jared Goff. They have no chance at those guys, it would seem right now. So you do enough to make the playoffs, but not enough to get the franchise quarterback. And as we've seen with so many teams, having a franchise quarterback is, the move that essentially sets you up for the next 10 or 15 years if you're lucky enough to do that. That being said, the Seahawks, they put themselves out of position when they needed a quarterback in 2011 and 2012. They put themselves out of the position to get a really good quarterback. They didn't have, the opportunities to do the traditional way of finding a quarterback. They took a lot of low-risk shots, sort of, with, Tavares Jackson and Charlie Whitehurst. And then they find this guy, Russell Wilson, in the third round, which is so rare to do, to find a franchise quarterback outside of the first round, let alone outside of the top 15, but they managed to do that for a team like, do you think that when you looked at Russell Wilson in 2012 and when you look at the class this year, is there anybody that you think that could get drafted by the Houston Texans or another team that needs a quarterback that could maybe not be as good as Russell Wilson? Because I think that is, in the sense of where he was drafted, maybe not in the sense that they can find that guy, but do you think that there's a guy capable of leading a team, for the next 5 or 10 years that will not go in the first round?
I think it's possible. Certainly, as much as I don't like Connor Cook as an early round pick, I mean, he could be someone who, if you put him in the Broncos team, he might be able to keep things ticking over, especially with the weapons that they have. And if they can keep the running game going, he's somebody who could just sort of hold the fort a little bit. And Christian Hackenberg's an interesting guy because he physically has got everything that you want in a franchise quarterback. He's just very inaccurate. So, can you maybe tweak his technique a little bit? Can you train him up maybe over 1 or 2 years and then unleash him? That's what I'd be looking at. But I mean, as far as comparisons to Russell Wilson, I think that I'm pretty sure that the Seahawks have got this current generation's answer to Tom Brady. The Seahawks have done what every team's fan base dreams of them doing, which is finding that guy, later in the draft. And it was Brady all those years ago with New England, and it's Russell Wilson this time. The Seahawks have done the impossible. They've found the diamond in the rough. And we will look back in 10 years' time and wonder how on earth the Seahawks managed to do it, because the production that Wilson had, the character that he showed, the winning that he had in college, the technique, the personality, everything suggested he was going to be a champion. And the Seahawks should be praised for their ability to find that. There isn't anybody even remotely close in this draft to that, not even in the first round. So there isn't a guy like that. And just to throw another name, Kenny, while we're talking about quarterbacks, I mean, let me just ask you this. If you were the Texans and you had J.J. Watt and you had a really fierce defense and you had DeAndre Hopkins, wouldn't you just rather wait another few days and have Colin Kaepernick be on the free agent market, assuming that San Francisco cuts him, which seems pretty likely if they can't deal him? And as kind of erratic and as stroppy as Kaepernick can be, even if you just had him kind of running around and doing his thing, this is a guy who has still taken a team to a Super Bowl in the last 3 or 4 years. Would he not be a better would you not rather take a chance on him panning out for the next year or two than spending $15 million a year on Brock Osweiler, who's played about 5 games? I mean, for me, it would be pretty simple. I would rather sort of I would say to Kaepernick, having signed him, go and prove everybody in San Francisco wrong. Put that chip on his shoulder, go and lead this team, go and win the AFC South for us this year. Would that not be a better option on a prove-it deal over 1 or 2 years than throwing your lot in with Osweiler?
I think that the play of the quarterback for all 32 teams, I think that the quality of play, for the most part, for every single one of these teams at quarterback, the most important position, falls mostly on the shoulders of the coaching staff. And if it doesn't matter who the quarterback is, I think that there are coaches out there that have the ability to get the most out of whatever they are given, and that's what's going to be the difference. It doesn't matter if it's Colin Kaepernick. It doesn't matter if it's Phillip Rivers. It doesn't matter if it's Peyton Manning when he's good or Peyton Manning when he's dead. At the end of the day, it's going to come down to what the coaching staff does with the quarterbacks that they are given. In 2010, were the Seahawks good? No, but they took Matt Hasselbeck at a time when he had almost nothing left to give, and they made the playoffs, and they won a playoff game, and Hasselbeck was okay. The next year, they had Tavares Jackson, and were they great? No. But in the second half of the season with Tavares Jackson, you could see them being a playoff team with Tavares Jackson. It just took, a couple months for them to sort of start to get a feel for it. But in the second half of that season, they started to look like a fringe playoff team. And then they take, Russell Wilson, and in his rookie season, he's not doing that great for the first half of the year. But as things start to click, they get the most out of this third-round rookie 5-10 quarterback, and they make the playoffs. And going into the playoffs, they're probably the best team in the NFL. And I think that the last 3 seasons with Russell Wilson and his maturation into, arguably one of the top 3 quarterbacks in the NFL, was he always capable of? Is he, he is that containment that he has the ability to be that good. But if he was playing, for another coach on another team, he might look like an average quarterback. I think that he would start for all 32 teams, and that there isn't a coach necessarily that could ruin that, in the same way that you couldn't ruin like a Ben Roethlisberger or ruin Tom Brady. That they're that good, and they'll succeed where they go. But at the end of the day, I think you really have to question Bill O'Brien's ability to get the most out of his quarterbacks. And I think that when you look at the play of a Brian Hoyer last year or Ryan Mallett and the wishy-washy attitude that Bill O'Brien had with his quarterbacks, he names, they go through the hard knocks thing, and they name a starter. They pull him in week 1. They name the next guy the starter. They pull him a couple weeks later. They name the next guy the starter. They put TJ Yates on IR like before the season. So they've got all this miscommunication with the GM and Rick Smith, and sort of confusion about whether or not they actually legally put or if they were put TJ Yates on IR because they were trying to save some money and stash him for the next year. I've heard stuff like that. But I think at the end of the day, I would still have to question whether or not it doesn't matter which quarterback the Texans get. I would seriously doubt their ability to get the most out of that quarterback. So, I think if you have a Colin Kaepernick, or if you have a Chase Daniel, or if you have a Robert Griffin III, or if you have, a Paxton Lynch type player, whatever it is, we saw the way that Pete Carroll has treated Russell Wilson over the last 4 years. He never put anything on his plate that he couldn't handle. And I think that I saw like Brian Hoyer last year, when he was put all this pressure on and put stuff on his plate that he couldn't handle, that's when he crumbled. We haven't seen Russell Wilson crumble because Pete Carroll is a great coach. I seriously question all of the coaches out there that don't know how to give their quarterback as much as they can handle. And if you were put in a position like the Seahawks were for those first 3 years of Carroll, where your quarterback might not be able to handle a full plate, don't give him 2 plates worth. And we see that mistake being made everywhere. So, yeah, if the Houston Texans want to wait and get a Colin Kaepernick, I think that he could definitely be the best free agent acquisition for quarterbacks this year. But even with a guy like Ryan Fitzpatrick with the Jets last year, I think that Todd Bowles was maybe his first coach that really knew how to give Ryan Fitzpatrick everything that he could handle and put him in the best position to succeed. So that would be my biggest concern for not just for the Texans, but for everyone and for all of these quarterbacks. It's got to be the coaches. It's got to come down to the coaching. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And this is, and it is down to the coaching, and it's how they structure their offense around the quarterback and what they ask them to do, and sort of, I think, managing limitations and accentuating abilities is one of the biggest thing a coach can do. And it's one of the biggest problems that coaches have when they either inherit quarterbacks or then sign ones that they're not entirely sold on, is that they get frustrated because they want, I think that's part of the issue with Bill O'Brien and the quarterbacks that he had, is that he brought these guys in, doesn't really believe in them, thinks they can just do a job for him, and then he wants them to do X, Y, and Z because he's not really interested in sort of developing these players. He wants them to do his offense. And when they struggle, he gets very impatient, frustrated, gives the next guy a chance. He can't do it either, and the situation becomes a mess. It's very different when you draft a guy. If Bill O'Brien suddenly drafts Christian Hackenberg and it's his guy and his reputation is going to be based on whether or not he can get this guy playing, I think we will see a very different approach whereby they will take things very slowly with a Hackenberg, managing him through the first year or two, maybe even sitting him for the first year or two, and then sort of bringing him along slowly, because it's the bias of a coach bringing his guy when he knows his reputation is on the line. Bill O'Brien's reputation was never on the line with Brian Hoyer playing quarterback. And that is, part of the issue there, that the coach has to know what his quarterback's limitations and his skills are, and he has to do the best job possible to sort of make that player shine in a system. And I think for the most part, Todd Bowles did that in New York, and or at least offensive coordinator, it was the former Bills head coach, did, Chan Gailey. So I think that that's part of the issue that Bill O'Brien has got, and it's probably why Bill O'Brien, the best thing he could probably do is go out and draft his own damn quarterback, because if he signs Brock Osweiler on a 3-year contract, he's probably going to have the same issue that he's always had. I think he needs his own guy, and I don't think until he has his own guy, he's going to be able to manage that guy properly.
Well, we are out of time this week on 3000 NFL Mock Draft, and I think that's a good note to end it on. And yeah, it just is, if you want to look at the same, theories for quarterbacks and coaches, I mean, you can look at the good coaches that can manage to stay successful even during injuries, such as Tom Brady's injury in 2008 when the Patriots won 11-5 with Matt Castle, and the fact that Gary Kubiak kept a pretty even keel, whether it was with Peyton Manning or Brock Osweiler. So it's not always going to be like you're going to get the best quarterback play, but these guys know how to adapt and how to adjust. And it's nice, if you're a Seahawks fan, how comfortable that is now these days in 2016, knowing that not only do you have one of the best coaches in the league, but one of the best quarterbacks as well. So that's it for this week on 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Staten with an O in both the Rob and the Staten. And follow on me on Twitter at Kenneth Arthur S. Come back next week for the next edition of 3000 NFL Mock Draft. And go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com and FieldGoals.com. And until then, we will catch you on the next draft.